Welcome, Sean, and welcome to all you that have joined us through the live streaming on another class on politics according to the Bible. I've enjoyed this immensely on all the classes that we've been able to do and cover. Sean's going to join us today. He's going to bring some insight into his knowledge and his wisdom and his learning. He's just finishing up a PhD in philosophy. And he's really helped his church a lot in the area of apologetics. And so we're going to be talking about communication, but in order to get into communication, we've got to ask a few things, how to ask questions and so on. So we're going to talk about that a bit today. We've kind of started off, if you have followed us all the way through, we began with understanding the sovereignty of God and how God had a plan, how he had instituted government. We kind of transitioned from that, looking at that and say, okay, how did our founding fathers carry that forward into what we have today as a republic, and also as within the Constitution, all the founding documents that we have. We've looked at marriage and family, and we've looked at protection of life, and we've looked at a lot of different topics. And I know one of the big issues that we have in culture today is how do we communicate with a culture, and sometimes even a culture that wants to hurt us, okay, if we hold a particular view. But so how do we do that? And so what we're going to spend some time today is looking at how do we communicate within that. I want to start off by just looking and revisiting a few things. Number one is looking at a biblical worldview and understanding that we all have a worldview. Okay, and it is made up of a lot of different things that have happened in our life, from where we grew up, what church we might have gone to, what kind of education that we had, just a number of things that would influence us into what kind of worldview that we have. What we've tried to do throughout this class is look at this from a standpoint of I need to have a foundation, and that foundation needs to be focused around the Bible. And I need to, within my mind, settle into my mind that God has a solution for whatever's going on in this world and whatever I'm dealing with, okay? So I have to settle in my mind that God has a solution, that the answers that I need to have answers for, the questions I need to have answers for, can be found in the Bible. And so that it builds on a belief, a truth, and a reality. And when we think about reality, there's only one reality. That's God's reality. And that's reality, and that's truth, whether I accept it or not. Okay? I can have my opinions, I can have my feelings, I can have all this, but God is the foundation for what we can believe. He's the foundation for our belief, and it's represented in truth, and it's represented in reality. I want to start with just a couple of questions, or not questions, but scriptures. And this is, again, I just want you to think about this. This is our role. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Okay, so who are we talking about there? We're talking about Jesus Christ. So in the beginning was the Word, and now we have the Word, we have it written to us. And what is our responsibility for that? As we go through it, is in Romans the 12th chapter, the second verse, it says, do not be conformed to this world, and be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. Okay, so when we look at this worldview that we're trying to build on, it has a foundation of who God is, okay? He's the one that created it. When we look at God's design for the state, He created it, and He took us through it, and He said, I'm building this government. In Romans the 13th chapter, we've gone there many times. I'll read it again, Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So every government, whether we believe it again or not, God said, here's what it is. He has created these And there's no authority except from God, and there's a purpose behind it. He goes on to say that we're not to go against that government because there's a purpose behind it. In Proverbs 21:1, it says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." So again, all the chaos that's going around on this election, at some point you have to just kind of settle down and say, God's got it handled.
Right.
I do my part. I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote based upon the biblical worldview that I've established in myself, okay, based upon what the Bible is telling me, what is right and wrong. And we've covered off just a few of those things, not a lot of them, okay, but we've covered off a few of them. And if you want a good book, there's a good book called Well Versed. And within it, it covers off a lot of different topics. Okay, you can get into abortion. Certainly, we've done that. What we try to do in this class is kind of taking on some of the basic fundamental topics that we know are right or wrong. Okay, then you get in sexual orientation, gender identity, healthcare, capitalism versus socialism. We've had debt, welfare and workplace, Social Security, the judiciary, hate crimes, social justice, refugees, media. And we may talk a little bit about media next week because that topic has really come up. But there's a lot of different topics that could go on that are listed in this book. It's helpful in that it's not a hard read. You can pick up and read about a particular topic. It'll give you some biblical scriptures to look at that will help you, again, focus on that. And as we look at how we're going to deal with the culture, we look at the kingdom culture, and we've done this a lot as we've looked at this, because I think we have to understand there is a foundation in society. Mm-hmm. And when I look at this, Sean, and I say there's a foundation, and it rises up out of that foundation. And when I look at the issues that are taking place, I don't care what it is, whether it's education, entertainment, media, government, all these different pillars that end up building our society. All we have to do is look at the dominant forces within those pillars. Who has the voice? Who's speaking the narrative out there in those pillars, and it directs our society.
Right, and I think this is the importance of what you were talking about earlier of when we're talking about worldview, right? Because worldview is so foundational, since it is not only what we are using to answer those big questions of life, right? Where we come from, where are we going, why are we here, what is the good,
right?
What is evil, and those types of things. But worldview undergirds everything that we know and how we interact with the world, whether we do it consciously or subconsciously, right?
Right.
So it comes out in how we speak, how we think. It comes out in how we behave, and so it's a very powerful shaping force of our lives. And this is foundational, and if we're all working from different foundations, those columns that you're trying to build, whether it's the family or the government or education or the arts or anything like that, that's going to be resting on very uneven ground, unstable ground.
Right.
And one individual or a small group isn't going to have enough of a foundation to support all that, right? And so we need something much stronger than just our personal view.
And I think what it also carries over, Sean, a bit is into politics.
Absolutely.
So politics ends up getting involved in these areas, and when you look at, and we'll touch on this next week, but education, we look at getting involved in media. Mm-hmm. They're getting involved in media, they get involved in entertainment, and so politics, and when we look at the government, what we really wanted out of the government was the government to protect me, number one, okay, and to create an environment of good, okay?
Or create an environment where we could do good.
Where we could do good,
right.
You're absolutely right, yeah. So when we branch beyond that and we start getting into all these other areas, that it begins to shape our world and shape our nation. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's not what we were intended to do. I think one of the things that, as we look at these issues, we look at words and definitions. And I brought this up some time ago, and I have to say it was shocking to me a bit because I had never heard the word woke. I had to have my daughter, who's in psychology, to explain to me gaslighting, okay? Because I didn't know about gaslighting. And critical theory, I kind of had that always kind of was more about critical thinking, but not critical theory. So critical theory was almost a new term for me. Cancel culture, I had heard, and I'd seen on media different ways in which we're trying to cancel out culture, but I really did not understand these. So I think one of the things that's challenging for us is before I can enter into a conversation, I need to understand the definitions.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. We do need to understand the definitions, and I think that's a lot of where the conversation probably needs to begin, is defining what it means, what these terms mean, and what they mean. This whole idea of critical theory really strikes at what does it mean to be human,
right?
And one of my favorite. Going back to worldview again, I mean, because I think it's all tied in, part of it, right? Is A.W. Tozer has the quote that what comes into our mind when we think of God is the most important thing about us,
right?
And I'm sure you've heard me say this in classes before, but I think everybody's a theologian on some level, right? Because we either consciously or unconsciously ask a question about God: does God exist or not?
Right.
And those who think he exists, they live their life either aware or unaware in particular ways. And those who don't think he exists, that shapes their life, right?
Right.
And not only does it shape our life in terms of what we think about God, but it also shapes our lives in terms of what we think about what we are.
Right.
Right? Because I understand myself as a Christian, I understand myself as a human being through understanding who God is, right? Because he informs me of who I am.
Right.
But if I don't believe there's a God, then I have to inform myself of who I am. And when I start to inform myself of who I am, I start taking the essential things of what it means to be a human being and kind of putting those on a lower level and raising other things that I think that are non-essential about me,
right?
And raising those up and making those important things, whether that be my gender, or whether it be my race, or whether it be my political affiliation, or I look for other ways to identify, right, and then those things become the main thing,
right?
And my actual human nature, the thing that actually connects us, becomes secondary and breaks down.
And the reality of that, you walk away from the understanding, most critically, I think, of being that we are all in sinful nature. We're all sinners. Okay, so I don't recognize my sin.
Right.
And so that's where, when we really started off some time ago talking about morality and objectivism, where there is a right and a wrong, or relativism, where there basically is I get to choose what's right and wrong, okay?
Yeah.
And so that's where we start breaking down as a society as well.
And that's right. And it becomes more difficult. I mean, we really make our jobs a lot harder.
Yeah.
to not only deal with ourselves individually, but to deal with ourselves in a society, right? In some type of political society, because when you remove God from the picture,
right,
God is the source of reality, right? That's the source of reality. So when we move God from the picture, we're no longer dealing with reality now.
Right.
Now we're dealing with some made up thing that we're trying to wrangle and navigate in life, and so that's why it becomes hard to deal with something like even just the word sin.
Yes.
Because you need something objective,
Yeah.
that standard to have there. And if you remove God from the picture, you no longer have that. Now it just becomes, what do I do I think I'm a good person? Well, yeah, all things considered, I think I'm a good person.
I'm
Am I a
better
good
than this
person?
guy over here.
Right, exactly. Am I a good person? No, not right.
Yeah.
Not if I'm not if my standard of measurement is a perfect and holy and righteous God. Right, I'm not. But if I'm comparing myself to my neighbor, well, yeah, I'm probably a pretty good guy.
Yeah.
But that
And we can judge that
Absolutely,
however I want
yeah.
to judge it. You know,
yeah, and it's no standard at all after it.
Right.
Right. And so, but that's why sin goes by the wayside, right? Because now I'm judging myself by myself.
Yeah. And that's the challenge with critical theory when we get into it. You know, it's always about the oppressed versus the unoppressed or the oppressor. So we're either in one of those camps, and like you said, you're moving away from essentials into something else that
Right.
is guiding us down that path.
Right.
And we never can come to an understanding because I am essentially who I am. I don't get to change that. Yeah, I
Right.
was born a man, okay, a boy, okay, and I mean I can get that changed, I guess somehow,
Mm-hmm.
but that's who I am. I'm white. I was fortunate to be born in the United States.
Right.
I could have been born in another country. I could have been born a different color. I could have been. Those are all accidents that, you know, that those are things I had no control over.
Right.
You know.
And I mean, I don't know if we want to. I mean, doing stuff in philosophy, I don't know if we want to go back to Aristotle, right? Because I think Aristotle does a really good job of defining what it means, what human nature is.
Right.
Right. And then Christianity can add to that definition to inform us more. But Aristotle, you know, his definition of human nature is that we are rational political animals. Right. And so if we talk about rationality, we're talking about reason, being able to think critically, being able to
Right.
use logic, and being able to carry on rational conversations and dialogue, right, with another person. By political, Aristotle would have meant that we're social beings,
Mm-hmm.
that we're made for communities, and how do we govern and have justice within that social
Right.
context, right? And then all he means by animals is that we have a physical body and that we're able to our senses, right? That we're able to
Right.
gather information from the world. And then Christianity lays on that image bearers, right? That we're made in the image of God. And so
That's why all this is critical.
that's all those critical, and that's what's essential about us, right? Those are not accidents. Those are things that when we talk about human beings, that's what it means to be a human being. This idea of critical theory, is it true that in the world there are oppressors and oppressees?
Yes.
Sure there is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But that's not, but
Those aren't the essentials.
those aren't the essentials.
Yeah.
That I happen to be born white,
Right.
I could have easily have been born some other color,
Right.
right? Or that I was born male, I could have been born female, right?
Right.
And so those things are not essential to who I am. They're just, but even though they're part of who I am, they're not the core thing.
Right.
But when I put all my emphasis on those things,
Right.
and then make that as the standard by which I start to judge and fragment and divide and everything, that's
And even how I feel about myself.
sure.
I mean, that's
Right.
that's one of the challenges because that's one of the conversations. We didn't get into this too much in education, but that's one of the topics that comes up when they're teaching sex education to fifth graders or kindergartners even, and saying, how do you feel about yourself? Do you feel like you're a boy or a girl? So anyway, one of the things that we want to touch on here is that the importance of understanding words and definitions. And so when we look at this, and you mentioned critical thinking, when somebody asks you why you believe you're a Christian, what do you say? And I have two examples down there. I said one because I met Jesus and he radically changed my heart, and so I can provide my testimony, okay, and that's a powerful thing. That is a very powerful thing to do.
Sure.
But it may not relate to you, okay, because it's my experience.
Right.
And you have a different experience with God maybe. that you've prayed and God didn't answer your prayers?
Yeah, I think, no, testimonies are good. Testimonies are our experiences, right? And so for us, I mean, there's something that we actually went through, or
Right.
we've experienced or felt, or whatever, however we want to couch that. And so for us, that's as true as anything else. But it's still subjective, right?
Right.
It's not any type of demonstrative proof in any way.
It's not evidence.
Right, of just saying, well, this happened to me and it changed my life. Okay, well, that you kind of think of, put on my apologetics hat here, right? You think of like a Mormonism, right, where they think that, or they would believe that, the Book of Mormon and those things are true because they had a burning in the bosom.
Right.
Well, that's great, but that can't be the whole story, right? You have to have more,
There
right?
must be more evidence than
Yeah,
that.
I think William Lane Craig says that we have to both show and tell, right?
Right.
And so it's through our actions, through the things that we do, but we also have to tell and give reason and give evidence and those types of things to help support our claims, right? How do we know something is true? Well, we demonstrate that it's true either through historical evidence or through philosophical argumentation, or the experience of those types of things. So
Yeah, and I think that's as we get into apologetics. So what is apologetics? That's a big question. So
I have no idea. Yeah, apologetics is very important, right? Just in the life of the believer,
Right.
the life of the people sometimes. Well, I think for one thing, the word is foreign to a lot of Christians, right? Of what it is, it sounds like a very technical word, and maybe it is. But apologetics is both defending and commending the faith, right? Your faith of both defending it from attack and defending it also from false characterizations and stuff like that, right?
Right.
Where somebody's setting up something kind of false about it, and you're defending it from that, or maybe it's just a misunderstanding of what they think Christianity is, right? And so it's correcting a misunderstanding. But then apologetics is also commending, right? It's you wanting to demonstrate in a positive way that Christianity is true. And I personally like to do that, through the argument for the resurrection, right?
Right,
I think that because there's a lot of historical data that we can go to and look at and demonstrate that, yes, this really happened.
Right.
And so it's both of those things. It's both defensive and it's offensive.
Right.
Right. And sometimes people will say, "Well, I don't need apologetics. I don't do apologetics." And so then you always ask, well, if somebody asks you a question about your faith, what do you say?
Exactly. That's what we're.
You say anything?
Yeah.
If you say nothing,
Yeah.
then you're not doing apologetics. But if you give some type of response, if you give some type of answer, that is, in a very broad sense, apologetics. That you're answering questions, you're answering objections, or you're answering clarifications. Right. That's the work of apologetics.
And when the purpose of this, when we look at this next question, it's a repeat of the previous slide. But if you can put your testimony, which you ought to be prepared to give, along with evidence, okay,
Right.
now you have a powerful, convincing, a conversation you can have with somebody that might persuade them. That's what we're looking for, is persuasion of why should I believe that this Jesus Christ lived and died, was resurrected, and ascended into heaven. Why should I believe that? It's not just a made-up story. Well, anyway, we're going to watch a video here that'll give us some more insight into what is apologetics.
Some days, I wish I had a normal job. The late philosopher and theologian Francis Schaeffer, he referred to apologetics as pre-evangelism. This is the idea that God uses well-reasoned answers and arguments as a springboard to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Oxford theologian Alistair McGrath, he says this: apologetics lays the ground for the invitation, evangelism extends it. That's it exactly. Apologetics and evangelism work together. For example, for many people, it makes no sense to talk about the Son of God, who communicates the Word of God, who performs acts of God, and brings the salvation of God, unless there is a God. This is where apologetics is so valuable. Apologetics lays the ground, it builds the foundation for belief in God through arguments and evidence. This is pre-evangelism. Now, in addition, the culture is deeply saturated in at least three dominant philosophies: relativism, pluralism, and naturalism. This is the cultural water that we all live in. Relativism says, well, there is no truth. Pluralism says there's no religious truth. And naturalism says there's no supernatural truth. Do you see a problem in doing evangelism in this cultural climate? We are presenting absolute truth to a relativistic culture, exclusivist message to a pluralistic culture, and a supernatural view to a naturalistic culture. It is no surprise that Christians are confronted with questions like, how can Jesus be the only way? Or, hasn't science proven that miracles are impossible? Or, who are you to force your morality on me? These questions are born out of a secular worldview that we swim in. Apologetics responds to these questions at the worldview level. Now, these philosophies produce questions that become obstacles to the gospel. I call them gospicles. Now, everyone say gospical. Okay, the apologist's job is to help remove these gospicles, these obstacles to the faith. We answer questions, respond to challenges, refute bad philosophy in the hope that people, with the help of the Holy Spirit, will be more receptive to hearing and receiving the gospel. In an address delivered in 1912, over 100 years ago at Princeton Theological Seminary, J. Gresham Machen, he says false ideas are the greatest obstacle to the reception of the gospel. Under such circumstances, what God desires us to do is to destroy the obstacle at its root. That's the job of apologetics. Not only does the Bible command apologetics, but the culture also demands we use apologetics to reach them. At Stand to Reason, we help Christians think clearly as they share their worldview with others. If you want to see more videos like this, click the subscribe button.
All right, so when we think about apologetics, Sean, some churches don't understand the term, number one, but they aren't accepting of it. And I know you probably experienced that some in things that you've done with Smart Faith and some other teaching that you've probably done.
Yeah.
So what's the objection? Is it just not understanding the term?
I think that's part of it. I think some of it is not understanding the term, that it's a biblical term. I mean, it's found in 1 Peter 3:15, right? The Greek apologia, which means to defend or to give reasons or those types of things. And so I think that there's just a misunderstanding of the term, because maybe the term sounds very technical or very academic, right? And I can understand that. And so maybe we could use a different term. I don't know. Maybe we could, I mean, the scripture uses a different term. It says give the reason for the hope that you have, right? It's the idea of giving reasons for why we believe.
Right.
And that's really what it means. So there's that. I think depending on the cultural climate that a church may be in, sometimes they can be a little anti-intellectual, or not necessarily that they're anti-thinking, but just that they may feel like there's too much of an emphasis placed on the mind and philosophy and logic. And the Bible warns us against philosophies, right? Well, the Bible warns us against worldly philosophy, but it doesn't warn us against philosophy per se, right?
Yeah. I can tell you though, one thing that we here in this church at Canyon have gained from your ability to teach this, because not only you've taught it as in adult classes, but you've taught it to our teens as well. And I think that one of the things that I was always impressed with, because a lot of young people, especially teenagers, have questions that on their minds, and how do I answer that? And if we don't prepare them before they go off into the world or into the universities, then we have there's a good chance that their minds are going to be filled with something else from a liberal point of view, and not be able to defend themselves.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you don't pull together a football team, right, and then send them out onto the field with no equipment.
Right.
Right. Yeah. You don't try and recruit soldiers and then send them out into the world with no weapon or anything like that, right? And Paul tells us we're in a warfare, right? Although he says it's not a warfare of flesh and blood, it's a warfare of ideas, is what Paul says. And so we have to prepare not just ourselves but others, if we can, to deal with that war of ideas and the spiritual warfare and all of that, right? I mean, as an elder,
yes,
that's part of your charge, right? Is the spiritual. How do we prepare the flock for the spiritual warfare, right? And I'm trying to help. How do we prepare them for the war of ideas and the intellectual side? But both of those are in a lot of ways the same thing, right? We're trying to do the same.
Well, and it really goes into the next slide, which is engage. And 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter says, put in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord with holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Okay, but I have to be prepared for that defense.
Imagine that.
Yes, it's going to come.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
It's not if, it's when.
Yeah, and we as Christians can't cower from this, because otherwise, what's happening to us in our society is the narrative is being controlled in those pillars by somebody else,
right,
and not by Christians.
Right.
Okay, and so the world, the society is moving towards in a direction away from God, and towards these other thinking, the other philosophies that are out there. And so one of the things that we look at this, we've got to figure out, how do we engage? Okay, and I think one of the things that is, when we're engaged, sometimes we take all the responsibility on ourselves, and we say, I've got to answer this question.
Right.
And most times I don't even know yet what the topic is, so I've got to be able to ask probing questions, and one of them is that Stand to Reason has and has come up with this whole. I guess it was theirs to start with, but I don't know who actually started this. Socrates. Okay, okay, but how did you come to that conclusion?
Right. Yeah. Greg Koukl likes to call them the Columbo.
Yes.
Questions, right? The Columbo tactics, or their tactics.
And probably even leading into this is, what do you mean by that?
Right.
Or what do you mean by, when you're talking about critical theory, what do you mean by critical theory? Getting them to define what it means to them, because this is a broad, really, topic in and of itself, I think.
It is, and going back to that 1 Peter 3:15 passage,
right.
I mean, Peter puts things in a certain order there, and I'm big on what's the order, right? And the first thing he mentions, that you first have to have Christ as Lord in your heart,
right?
Right. That has to be the starting place. We have to have the vertical relationship, they're working in our lives and stuff, and that's part of the preparation,
right?
Right, because I can't defend something, or I can't commend something that I have no knowledge of.
Right.
Right. I'm not a mechanic.
Right.
I can't. Not only can I not fix my own car, but I can't recommend a car based on whatever the technical aspects of somebody. I wouldn't know. Right. So I can't. Not only can I not defend, or not only can I not fix, but I can't sell.
Right.
Not that we're trying to sell Christianity in that way, but if I don't know God, if I don't have a relationship with Christ, I'm not going to be an adequate defender, and I'm not going to be able to commend it either, right? And so first we have to have that in our hearts so that we can have that hope and give the reason for the hope, and then do it in gentleness and respect, which is the whole conversation side of this, right?
That's right.
And so, how do we engage? Well, I think you started off well there by saying we have to get people to define their terms, right? If somebody makes a claim about me, about what I know or what I believe, and it's not what I believe, I feel no obligation to defend it.
Right.
I'm like, well, it's nice that you think that's what I believe, but that's not what I believe, and I'm not going to waste my time defending something I don't believe.
Right.
Right. So, and this goes both ways, though.
Right.
I have to understand what the other person believes before I can really speak to it or get on some common ground with them. And so, yeah, asking questions is great. Kokel's model question in his tactics is, what do you mean by that?
Right.
Right. So, I don't believe there's a God. Well, what do you mean by God?
Yeah.
Because maybe your concept of God isn't something that I believe either, right? And so instead of me going into a whole dissertation on my understanding of God, I need to understand your understanding of God,
right?
So that I can help you. I can help.
And why you believe that?
Okay. Right. And why do you believe that? Right. I mean, what evidence do you have?
Right.
If you tell me that, you believe in Jesus, but you don't think that, and you think he was a historical figure, but you don't think he was the Son of God. Well, why? What evidence do you have that that he was a good moral teacher, but not the Son of God? Because the evidence seems to counter that.
Yeah,
so
definitely does.
So what evidence do you have? Yeah. So asking questions is always key, and it could be as simple as that.
Right.
What do you mean by that, or why do you believe that? Right. What reasons do you have for that belief?
One of the other things that we looked at is when did I not engage? When don't I engage? And you had
that's just as important.
Yes.
Right. So the last part of that verse is that we ought to have these conversations in gentleness and respect, right? And so I like to think of this as we want to speak truth, we want to speak it kindly, and we want to do it at the right time.
Right.
Because not every conversation that's truthful and kind, not every situation is set for that conversation, right? And so we may need to have to do it at a different time. And some of the times where we may not want to engage, and that's okay. Some of the times we may not want to engage are, and I got this from Dr. Frank Turek, he uses what he calls HALT, right? HALT, where it's all a acronym. So H stands for hunger,
right?
A stands for anger, L stands for loneliness, and T for being tired, right? And why may we not want to get into some of these conversations, not just Christian conversations, but political conversations or any of those, right? When we're in one of these moods, like if we're hungry.
Right.
Well, think about your own life, right? If you're hungry, how focused are you going to be on the conversation? And oftentimes we get irritable, right? And so we may be more apt to be more sharp in our tone or our language, or we may be apt to use poor word choices, right, when we're saying things, and say things that we don't really mean, but is not going to further the conversation or the relationship there.
Right.
And so on some of those, when we can identify in ourselves that we're hungry or angry or lonely or tired of stuff, we should probably put a pause and get ourselves right emotionally, and then come back and continue the dialogue.
And that goes with the other person.
Absolutely,
as well.
Yeah, it has to be both sides.
I mean, my wife Virgie knows not to have a conversation with me if I'm tired.
Right.
Okay, so it's not going anywhere.
Right.
And so it's a challenge. So I think and part of that is, as we're called to in 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, we're to be ambassadors
Yes.
And I love this verse. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. So our job is to be an ambassador. That's where that gentleness and respect comes in. We're to be this ambassador, and we have to have these essential skills that are part of that. We have to have knowledge. So we have to understand, what do I believe and what do I believe in? That's why this biblical worldview is so critical.
Right.
Is I have to create that foundation. Otherwise, I can't talk to somebody else if I don't know my own belief.
Right.
Okay? And then I've got to have wisdom, as we just talked about. It takes wisdom to know when to get into a conversation and when not to get into a conversation. You can't just plow forward and say, I'm gonna have this. I'm gonna say these words, whether you listen to me or not. And,
right.
And sometimes unfortunately, we say, okay, the Word of God is sharper than a two-edged sword. It pierces the heart, so I'm going to say it anyway and let God take care of it from there.
So I'm just going to go in and hack and slash,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So, we never want to, and I think this also goes back to the right play, or the right timing of the right place, right, of when to have these conversations, because we never want to embarrass the other person.
Exactly.
Right? We never want to talk down or denigrate the other person, right? Because we always have to remember that they're also a human being and they're created in the image of God, right? And that's, we always have to try and keep that first and foremost in our mind. And so, there may be times where it's perfectly fine, and it's probably better to not get in the conversation right then, right now.
But the other part of that, the third idea here, or topic, is character.
Right, and that's part of...
Yeah, because you're building up a respect that other person has for you based upon who you've been. They've seen you operate. Right. You've had consistency within your life, and therefore I might listen to you because of the character that I've had.
Sure.
And I've always said, this is a saying that I had years ago, which I think tears down a lot of people, but skills and talents can take you to a place where your character can't sustain you. Mm-hmm. And because if you haven't built your character up over years of preparation, just because you're skillful, just because you have knowledge, is not going to necessarily sustain you in the world that you're trying to live in.
Yep.
And I think we're kind of at the last of this, but I want to read a couple of scriptures. 1 Peter 2:12. It says, "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." So that's the whole character piece of that. So you can talk bad about me if you want, but you're going to see my good deeds. And in Hebrews 10:23-25 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of hope without wavering, for he who promised his faithfulness, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." I think we're challenged with that, with the pandemic going on, coming together and gathering together. But again, it tells us again a foundation of what God is wanting us to do. So as we look out at this and we say, what do I do about this? Well, I have an opportunity during this election. This whole purpose of this class is to build us up a biblical worldview. What does God say about some of these critical issues? And we've looked at protection of life. We looked at marriage and family. We've looked at what God says about government. We haven't covered all topics, at all. We're going to cover off a few next week again. But the whole purpose of this is to say, okay, I should be looking at the election and the candidates that I'm going to be voting for, and do they hold somewhat of a biblical worldview? Now, there's no perfect person out there, okay? Right. So, but you have to kind of line up and say, what is God expecting out of this, and how do I vote to support that? Next week, we're gonna take a step back in time and look at the American experiment. I'm going to use Psalm 72 as kind of the foundation for God's expectations of what we should be? And what does it mean to trust God's sovereignty over the direction of the world history? That's a challenge for all of us. We're challenged today with issues around fear and faith. And so many people have developed a consciousness around fear. To say I fear so much, whether it's a pandemic, all this is real. Okay, I'm not demeaning any of it. It's real. I understand that. But where is my faith within this? And basically, fear and faith have the same definitions. They believe in something that has not yet happened. One's positive and one's negative. Okay.
Well, in this whole idea of history,
Yeah.
I mean, what is it? What is history? I mean,
There you go.
a lot of revisionist re-understanding, right? And so having a clear, good grasp on what history is and what's true about history and what's not.
Right.
Takes some discernment and some filtering and some wisdom in there and stuff, and some knowledge.
You've got to go back and search.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's not Google search.
No.
That's actually knowing something, not just getting information off of the internet.
Yeah,
Right.
reading books and
Right.
reading good books and,
Right.
and getting information. That's right, especially reading your Bible. All right, we're done for today, but I hope one of the things I'm going to ask you the question, do you believe what you really believe is really real? And once you come to that belief, you then have a biblical worldview, and you're going to start living your life in a different way. The foundation has been laid, okay? When you come to that understanding, which should be soul-searching, should be a dedication to reading the Bible, to listening to good commentary and good educational people that have wisdom as well, that can lead us down this path, always bouncing that off of the Bible and what the Bible says. But do I believe what I really believe is really real? Thank you so much today, and I hope you have a great week.